I would like to introduce the next speaker, who is Ms. Christine Castley. She's been the CEO of Multicultural Australia. And prior to this, she had a 25-year career with Queensland government. You can read her full biography in the app. Can I please ask you to remain quiet so that we can move on to the next segment? I know we have lots of linguists here who want to use their linguistic skills. So Christine, we are very grateful that you could make it here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I am here in my capacity as a member of the Multicultural Framework Review panel, but I am also, in my day job, the CEO of Multicultural Australia. So I'd like to share with you Multicultural Australia's words to acknowledge country, which are words that we developed over 2 years of speaking to elders on country in our community to try to develop this, which is we who have come from many places acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We pay our respects to elders throughout all time and walk together in solidarity of the shared pain of the past and our shared hope for the future. I also want to acknowledge that we are in a country that was multilingual for many thousands of years, and that really has come to be seen more as being monolingual probably in the last 200 years or so. And I hope that we are at a pivotal point in history where we are ready to kind of go back to how we should be and how we are, both in recognising our First Nations languages, of the hundreds of First Nations languages on this land, but also to reflect the languages of the many people who have come to live in Australia. So thank you for the opportunity to be here at your conference, and I'm particularly taken by your theme of building bridges and strengthening alliances, because I think it reflects some very important dimensions of the purpose that sits behind the work that we all do in the multicultural and settlement sector and in the languages sector. So I see us as being part of the same family. And I know that in this room I'm preaching to the converted when I say that language has tremendous power. It's the essence of who we are as human beings, because human beings are social creatures, and we need language if we are going to be able to successfully connect with each other. In the world and a country that's becoming increasingly diverse and complex with a multitude of languages and cultures inhabiting the same spaces, interpreters and translators are fundamentally important as the bridge that connects us all despite our wonderful diversity and difference. You are the experts in how we navigate the barriers between different groups of people. You provide the pathways for meaningful connections between individuals from different countries and different backgrounds. You are a core part of what is needed to make multiculturalism truly successful in Australia. Which brings me to the Multicultural Framework Review that I'm here to speak to you about today. The review was launched by the Australian Government on 2 June at the Addison Road Community Centre in Marrickville, and being led by a panel of 3 people. So it's chaired by Dr. Haz Dalal, and with the panel including Nyadol Nguyen, human rights lawyer from Melbourne, both Haz and Nyadol from Melbourne, and myself from Brisbane in Queensland. I would like to take a moment to pass on Nyadol's apologies. She did really want to be here, but she did have every intention of coming, but I hope you'll appreciate we are actually getting into a very busy time. We're actually in the process of starting to draft our report. And it's kind of conference season, so I'm actually also going to have to leave fairly quickly after this to fly to Melbourne because I'm speaking at the Settlement Council of Australia conference tomorrow morning as well. The panel is being supported in the review by a reference group of people with lived experience in or supporting multicultural communities and bringing a mix of leadership, community and business experiences across all sectors. And the government was very clear that it wasn't picking people to represent each state or territory, while it was looking to get a diversity of experience and perspective, it was picking people with lived experiences and with a variety, and recognising as well we couldn't have everyone represented there. What I do want to assure you of is to share with you that, particularly for Nyadol, Haz and myself, each of us lives and breathes many of the issues that you experience. And if I can share from my particular perspective, Multicultural Australia, which is a Queensland-based organisation that does the humanitarian settlement program in Australia, I see all too often the impacts of our language services industry being underinvested in and not being deliberated on and not considered as a critical service too often in the health sector. And unfortunately, while we might say action might come when we actually see loss of life or someone wrongfully detained, I would put it to you that it already does happen. And that hasn't been a catalyst for change to date, which is tragically concerning and a blight on who we are as a country. I all too often will get a phone call in the morning about a matter that's in court, and one recent one where it was a custody issue around children, and the husband had absconded with the children during a visit, and it was discovered on that morning that there was one interpreter for the two parties who had a conflict of interest. And I got a call saying, can you find us an interpreter by 9:30 this morning? This call was at 8:30 in the morning. We did our absolute best to try to find someone. We didn't, and the judge adjourned the matter for a further 8 months. That mother, who had been waiting for about 4 months before that, was then going to have to wait. There's a number of issues within that in terms of, I think, the capability and the responsiveness of the judge, who should have tried to do a bit better, I think, in terms of bringing the matter on. But those issues around pre-preparation, to actually understand who are the individuals involved in this setting, to actually surface conflict issues before you're actually in court itself. All of these issues, if we do things better, will make a difference. I share with you another story of a particular health provider where there were two members of the family who don't speak English, newly arrived. It was a stillbirth. And the husband was acting as an interpreter and was too distraught to explain to his wife what was happening. And so she had no idea for quite a period of time. Now, that health service provider has since responded with a whole range of responses and have built their capability, but that's what it took. So we do have these instances where the issues are being responded to at the local level. But I share these with you because I know they're not unique stories, sadly. But to share with you that on the panel, we actually do, by working in this sector, actually see the reality of the issues that you see, that you've been trying to speak about and trying to communicate. And that will be reflected, hopefully, in the recommendations that we make. In conducting our review, the panel's been determined to consult as deeply and widely as possible. So firstly, and most importantly, we ensured that information about the review would be accessible in multiple languages. So information about the review was made available on the website in 35 languages. And we made it clear, we communicated that submissions would be accepted in any language. So the submissions have now closed. We've received just over 815 submissions, which shows the degree of interest that there is in the multicultural review. And 125 were submitted in languages other than English. We're going through that process. And we did that as much about accessibility as to also try to role model how government should be engaging with the community, and that it is possible. So we received submissions in Arabic, Greek, Spanish, Farsi, Hokkien, Taiwanese, Korean, Portuguese, Sinhalese, Serbian, Thai, Vietnamese, Mandarin, Cantonese, and we're just working through all of those, and some of those will be quite powerful quotes in the report. We've also conducted extensive consultations across Australia, travelling to all states and territories, including regional and metropolitan areas. And I want to make clear here that we've been very deliberate about saying that we were not just going to do city-based consultations and conversations. We made a really deliberate effort to get out to recognise that Australia is very diverse in its geography in terms of rural, regional and remote communities. And meeting with people from a number of different kind of sectors, we do have a particular focus on youth as well as a key theme that we want to focus on in terms of looking to the future. We've met with a variety of individuals and groups, including from federal, state, local governments, multicultural leaders, community representatives, organisations, academics, think tanks, sporting clubs, service providers, business groups, unions. We've tried to get out there and not say multiculturalism is a unique boutique niche issue that sits in one part of Australia. It spreads itself through all of our community. And just to give you a sense, as of November, as a panel, we've consulted with over 1,430 individuals, met with 767 unique organisations, agencies and individuals in all states and territories. I'd probably describe us as inspired but tired. We're inspired because the conversations have been amazing. When people have come along to speak to us, there are many issues of real-life instances, service delivery type issues and whatever else, but there's been a conversation here, a really important theme of conversation, where people have wanted to talk to us about the ideas of national identity. Who are we as a country, Australia? And looking at the population numbers that we have here, Rob's kind of referred to those numbers, where close to 50% are migrants or children of migrants, about 25%. But close to 40% speak a language other than English at home. So when we talk about issues of language, we're not talking about responding to a minority issue. We're talking about the population of Australia. There's some data we've also received, which I think is really interesting, and I think it's really useful to think about in the context of the sustainability of the sector, which is we do tend to talk about where do the largest chunks of people come from in terms of countries, and whether that's changed from being the UK or India or China. But the most recent data, which kind of we'll have in a bit of a pie chart, we show the difference. So you go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, predominantly from the UK or England, you see a pie chart that has this big kind of chunk. And in a few other kind of bigger countries, and then you kind of break it up, and over time, getting into the 80s to the 90s, 2000s, you get those other countries come through, India, China, etc. But when you look at it today, you do have those cohorts of key countries, but the biggest part of the pie chart is taken up by very little segments. The other is the big part of the population. So that whole variety of countries and language and nationalities and countries will not fit into neat little segments of how do we target investment and effort. It's complex and it's hard. And part of taking a discussion forward in terms of sustainability needs to recognise that you can't go for a one-size-fits-all and you can't chunk it up into particular kind of priority groups. We are going to have to need to think about how we design a system, how do we design solutions that take into account those other countries. And they're so small that we have to put them under a blanket definition of other countries in terms of those numbers, which creates really big challenges in terms of capability, capacity, finding the interpreters, particularly with more newly arrived communities, where it will take time to actually build people up to that capability to be able to enter into the profession. I use that word deliberately, of interpreting and translation. So there are those issues that we need to think about. And in the context of language as well, some of the issues that we've heard, so people have raised a whole raft of issues and challenges around how our systems and processes in Australia are really designed to be a one-size-fits-all, and not appropriate. So people have talked about things as micro as forms, how the design of a form that government has assumes everyone has a first name and a last name, maybe a middle name, and only a certain number of characters. And if your name is different, then you have to change it to fit that box to be able to access services, which is who you are. It's your identity. And if you don't remember what that alias was that you created, and you don't have the documents to back it up, then you've got Buckley's of being able to access your own information. There's no reason why that form needs to have those boxes. It's a form, but a very simple task. Well, it's not simple, I know, from IT perspective and all of those sorts of things, but a focused task to actually try to tackle an issue which actually is quite containable if we invest in, will create a significant change in terms of identity and belonging in Australia, a sense of welcome. Another example we heard from someone who works in the health services sector, I think, which stuck in my head, was to say, why when someone comes to us for a service, would we not say, what is your preferred language, rather than do you speak English? Just the use of that word sends a message about who we are as a country and how we accept who our population are. these are some of the things that we need to think about. You won't be surprised to hear that we heard a lot about qualifications, skills recognition, all of those issues in terms of people coming in. One thing that did surprise me was the access to the language proficiency test being a real barrier. Now, the language proficiency test being a real issue for people because particularly if you live in rural and regional Australia, having to access that test in capital cities becomes a real issue, and also the cost of doing so. The bit that surprised me about this was that even a person who has done their degree in Australia, who wants to then get registered, say, as a nurse or a teacher, but if you completed your high school in what is deemed under a list of countries as being non-English speaking, you have to do the English proficiency test. Not just once, but a number of times. And we heard about people who have done their high school in a different country, say India, then had to do English proficiency test to enter into a bachelor's degree here in Australia, then went into honours, had to do the English proficiency test again, then did a master's, had to do an English proficiency test again, and then is now wanting to do their PhD and will have to do the English proficiency test again because they come from India, which is a non-English speaking country. And the decisions around which countries go on that list of 60 seem to be based on very interesting criteria. It says it's a non-English speaking country, but a country like Liberia, for example, which has its entire schooling system in English, is a non-English speaking country. We heard about a person who has done her nursing degree here, who performed extremely well at university, has been employed for 2 years in an aged care services sector, and helped a work colleague also go through the degree, who is from New Zealand. This person was from Bangladesh. They've both now graduated. She cannot afford to fly to the capital city because she lives in a regional piece. And the time, her employer has contacted the registration body to offer to verify that she speaks proficient English, and that is not sufficient. So that person that she helped through the degree from New Zealand is now her supervisor until she can get time to get to do the test and save the money to do the test to then become registered for the profession for which she got her qualification here in Australia. The system is perverse. I don't know if it is intentional, whether it's intentional or not, it is perverse. And it needs to be addressed. In terms of the key themes around the language and translation, interpreting and translation space, I was just going to share with you at a fairly high level some of the things that we've heard. We're still working through our process. We have read the submission, amongst it many, which has really, really interesting issues. And I think we will be very interested to see what comes out of your conversation around your sustainability roundtable tomorrow as well. So if it's at all possible for us to get the information out of that as soon as possible, because we are currently writing the report and need to provide it very soon. And I'm very, very keen to feed in the issues and solutions and things that you need to be spoken about. But some of the key themes that we're kind of just thinking through in this space that we've distilled from the submissions that we've seen, and I framed these in the positive, and in terms of some of the key things that we will be thinking about, is that language services are a critically important pillar of effective and equitable multicultural policy to ensure access and equity in the provision of government services and information for all members of the community. It is essential to ensure that every individual and community who has made a life here in Australia has access to culturally appropriate and equitable access to services and information through proper provision of language services. This is particularly important in legal courts and health settings. However, many communities continue to struggle to find a translator or interpreter in their language, which forces a concerning reliance on family and friends to assist them in communicating. And I can share with you that any one of the panel members regularly comes across in our daily work people who think that they can use Google Translate. And it's done not in the absence, not because they don't want to use interpreter services. More often than not, it's because they're not able to, they don't have the budget. And this is another issue as well, that agencies do not generally have a dedicated, allocated budget for translation and interpreter services. So it's decisions around, say, for example, in a health setting, around where do you spend your allocated budget. It's, again, comes back to that point about it being recognised as a critical service that actually needs an allocated budget. A multicultural framework should encompass the intersectionality that exists in culturally and linguistically diverse communities of Australian society. So this includes deaf culture, hearing culture, and the many diverse forms of cultures who live in Australia. We need to recognise the very real and significant challenges to accessing language services in regional areas. And we need to take steps to ensure a sustainable language services sector. And I'll come back to that as well in a little bit, because that is a really important part of what we're talking about today. And this includes ensuring that language services are delivered by qualified and appropriately supported and remunerated professionals. So we will lead into these points in terms of everything that we've heard, and which are not new issues. We're well aware that these are not new issues, but we feel that we have an opportunity to really articulate them and put them out there and try to get them as a priority. We do need national consistency in the regulation of procurement of language services, recognising the diversity in states and territories and the need for mechanisms, but there needs to be an overarching set of consistent principles about what we're doing. So as it currently stands, language services procurement is different in every state and territory. There's a lack of transparency around the cost of interpreters, which is fees charged to clients and interpreter pay rates. And there's also a considerable pay gap between spoken and sign language interpreters. Importantly, there's no reporting or collection of data on requests for and delivery of language services. We don't know how many times a person requests and is denied an interpreter, or how many appointments go ahead without an interpreter. And I share with you, there's another role that I hold. I'm on the board of our Residential Tenancies Authority in Queensland, which does the bonds type stuff. And as part of that, in our regular training induction, we sit in on the call centre. I did one recently, and I would say pretty much every 1 in 3 calls was someone who was not a native English speaker. And on that call, I could hear a variety. Some people had the degree of capability. Some people struggle, and more often than not, I do have one woman in particular I remember just saying, wait, clearly woke up her teenage daughter to come on, and then you could hear the speaking happening. So all of that happens spontaneously. This woman was ringing to ask for information about her rental arrangements and wanted instant translation because she wanted information immediately. So sometimes that's okay, sometimes that's not. What's the standard? How do we kind of set the criteria for the person on that call to kind of say, hang on, I should get you an interpreter, but also to be able to do it in a way that doesn't say, well, actually, I think you need an interpreter, so let's talk to you in about 6 weeks' time, which is that issue. And the problem with the current system that we have, which has been based on a procurement system, which I think has been very much based on a premise of a race to the lowest, because it's been looking to become as lean as it can, means that it has no redundancy within it. And the complexity of the reality of the situation means that you do need to have a built-in redundancy to allow for responsiveness. How do you create that redundancy? That's a resource and investment that you need to actually think about. And that doesn't happen when you have an overriding kind of market kind of approach to how you actually procure your services. So in terms of sustainability of the industry, so key things, I've already talked about the profession, so pay, conditions, recognition, how that procurement happens, or perhaps it shouldn't be a procurement, perhaps it should be a provision of service for core kind of sets of services. That needs a fundamental shift. But something I'd like you all to think about as well as you continue to advocate for the sustainability of this profession as well is the broader ecosystem. So we ask ourselves, there is currently no national language strategy. And I think that is the ecosystem that's taken us to where we currently are at. It's broader than just translation and interpreted services. It's the issue about education. It's the issue about how do we recognise and lift up our capability as a multilingual country. It's about preservation of languages. Currently, there's a bit of a kind of ongoing kind of battle between the education sector and saying that languages are the province of the community sector, and that we should just do community language schools because we'll just do particular priority languages sometimes, but it's a choice. We've heard from parents who have parents who speak 2 languages and want to raise their children to be multilingual, but who have been saying that there are no support services to tell us how we might do that in the best way possible. Do I speak to my child in Spanish completely up until the age 5 and let them learn English as a second language when they go to school? Or do we have one parent speak to the child in one language or the other? And what we've heard about in quite a number of different spaces are the growth of community parent support hubs for parents of bilingual children. So the community is stepping up here. But our question then is what is government doing to enable that groundswell of community support? So certainly community should continue to have a role in this, but government also should be there as an enabler to make it happen. But it comes back to this notion of how we see ourselves as a country versus how we actually are as a country. So for the most part, Australia sees ourselves and others see us as a monolingual country that speaks English, and the journey for someone who arrives here is to get them on that journey to learn how to speak English. We do need a common language. So of course we should continue to invest in that capability, but it's not an either-or proposition. We need to think about how we lift our multilingual capability as a country, and that has significant social and economic benefits that we need to recognise. It positions us well to be a global player in an increasingly globalised world. It actually does mean that we can actually enhance many sectors, such as the tourism sector and the international education sector, when people can actually be made feel more welcome. I put this to you in terms of that ecosystem because I think you're only going to make progress if you're talking about yourself as a sector within that broader system. Multiculturalism, all the things that I've heard you saying about your sector kind of being dismissed, forgotten about, applies in that slightly broader ecosystem of multiculturalism. It's not seen as central to who we are as a country. And so you're kind of fighting a losing battle here unless you start playing in that broader space and also advocating on those issues, those broader language issues, and then also the broader space of who we are as a culturally diverse country. And you need to frame your advocacy, I think, in that context. And finally, I think what's become really clear to us as we've heard all of this and looked and travelled around about the countries is we need to resist the temptation for a one-size-fits-all solutions to the problems. Because I think, Rob, in your conversation, you've talked about kind of coming down to states and territories, but it actually drills down into sectors and into spaces and into local communities. And that's really hard. It's really hard to actually kind of know, and it's really hard to mobilise people to respond to that. But it being hard is not a reason not to do it. But the thing is, how do we get the settings right so it can actually happen? How does government think about how it enables, as well as how it kind of steps in when it needs to step in, but then how does it actually support community, picks out the good ideas and takes this forward so that we can actually become a stronger, better multicultural nation so we can actually realise who we are as a country. So that's just some reflections that I want to share with you. And I know it's kind of high level, tried to distill down into some issues. We actually have, in the course of Think On, we have to actually create a whole chapter on language alone. And even just talking about language services alone is another kind of huge piece again. So it's thinking about how we will frame that as we move forward in terms of making some recommendations. But the review, I think, is an opportunity where government will listen. Well, government's commissioned the report. It will be publicly released. So regardless of whether they choose to accept our recommendations out, what we say will be there and become a platform. We hope they'll accept the recommendations, but it certainly, I think, is a promising start and one part of that journey I think that we should all travel on together for a better Australia. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your inspiring words, and I'm looking forward to that report. We have until 6:35 for questions. Any questions this way? I'll be walking this way, and my colleagues will be that way. Sylvia, you want to ask a question? Yes. I'm coming.
Christine, thank you so much. My name's Sylvia. I'm actually part of the organising committee of this year's conference. We're thrilled that you were able to be with us today. I knew about the Multicultural Framework review, but personally, this is the first time that I hear as much detail and absolutely loved every aspect of your presentation. More than, starting from the acknowledgement of country and the significance that you gave to the recognition of what we are as a country, standing on the land, that people have stood for thousands and thousands of years, and that so many of us have come just in the last few decades, and not even that. So more than a question, a reflection, which really your words really made me think about. Firstly, what you said exactly about this country always having been and always will be a multilingual country. And that links also, I think, with something that, I must say, I've been in Australia for 40-something years, and I've heard the word multiculturalism for most of my life. And at some stage, I got to wonder why, when people spoke of multiculturalism, they were only speaking of migrants. How is it that what is seen as the dominant culture, which is, initially the colonial culture, how that is not part of the multi? Why is that the default and everything else is the multi, rather than multiculturalism, recognizing the cultures that made up our First Nations that are different amongst themselves, the colonizing cultures, and the newbies, all of those of us who came along later on. So that's, I guess, a reflection in terms as well of, what this framework review is, that it shouldn't just be about the migrants or the new ones. It should be about the multi, the many. And the other aspect of that, which I think goes to the language service and to it being a critical service to ensure access, I totally agree with that. But in a multilingual and multicultural country, it's also a critical service for those people who are monolingual and only speak English to be able to do their work.
Yep.
And that means I extend a challenge as well to all my interpreting and translation colleagues to not think about when we are working as interpreters and translators between two people or organisations of different languages, let's not think about the language other than English person being my client, because the other person also needs that service. Now, because that's not something that we hold true really within Australia, it means that the provision of that language service is always for the other. It's not seen as fundamental. And I do think that that's a really important cultural change that we need as a country to be really mature. And I am thrilled to hear you speak about a review that I feel is going to reflect that kind of notion. So thank you. And no question.
And if I can make a comment on that, we have come to the view that we will need to kind of really delve into this notion of multiculturalism and what it means, and that everybody has culture and ethnicity. And if we recognise that as a country, then we can have a much better and much richer conversation, and then think about how we all kind of share our capabilities and our needs. And then that links to a really nice argument about exactly what you're saying, that the service is being provided when you talk about language services to the person who only speaks one language or doesn't speak the language of the person they're engaging or interacting with, and kind of lifts that capability. It kind of creates the incentive to actually engage in this space. So certainly all of those are really, really important points. If I could just share one story as well. So in pretty much most of the states, we've had the Irish associations coming along going, we never get invited to the multicultural table. And we have our own needs. We recognise, there's different stages of transition. So to a large extent, I think the multicultural sector has got something to answer for in terms of saying who's allowed in and who is not, who is and who isn't multicultural. And so we need to get to this much broader notion of we are a multicultural, multilingual country, which is everybody. And just some have explored their heritage more than others.
Thank you so much for your words. First, I'd like to take the opportunity just to clarify a mistake that I made. When I made the submission for Osmond, it was also a submission for Castley.
Yes, it was.
But I forgot to make the change before I sent it on, and I was unable to correct it. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to share a story that echoes a little bit of what Sylvia was saying. When I first came to Australia, I was engaged to do a stakeholder engagement series across Australia on the issue of workers' compensation by Deakin University. And I went to, it happened to be South Australia, and we had meetings with stakeholders and so on. I recorded dutifully what was said, and then wrote a report and said, I would, from the point of view of a person learning, who learned American English, well, this stakeholder had this issue, and this stakeholder had this issue, and this stakeholder raised this issue, not understanding that in Australian English, the connotation of the word issue is quite negative. Whereas in American English, it's quite a neutral connotation. Well, that actually almost got me thrown out of the country. Because I was in here on a work visa, and the CEO of the organization that was overlooking it thought that the report was so disrespectful that he called up my CEO and tried to get me fired. And that, folks, was within English.
Yes.
So this whole idea that there is a whole range of culture that needs to be understood isn't just a language thing. It's a recognition that we are who we are, we bring with us what we bring with us, and all of this makes us richer.
Absolutely. No. And without wanting to be too superficial, I came to this country in 1984 from Malaysia, and I still talk about my first day at school when someone said, put your paw in the port rack and there's a swimming carnival tomorrow, so bring your togs. I spoke English at the time, but kind of went, what did that person just say? So language, dialect, all of these different things, these differences, if we recognise that richness and that difference, I think these are the conversations that we need to have in broader settings than just within ourselves to kind of lift the capability of everybody else in the country who think they're busy enough getting on with their own lives and intersecting, rather than intersecting with people such as us who kind of work and live in this space. It's just how do you have those conversations more broadly, and that's incumbent on us as much as it's incumbent on people to actually engage in this space.
Christine, we have time for 2 more questions, one over there and one here.
Hi, thank you very much, Christine. And I have a question. I'm a community interpreter and very small community, Mongolian community. And then Multicultural New South Wales, the panel, interpreter and translator, the panel cannot be open that everyone wants to register as an interpreter, because I'm requesting many times. I know that our community is small, and then there's lots of government agencies. The Multicultural New South Wales is a big organization, and then they find the interpreters for them. And then you have a very small amount of interpreters, lack of interpreters, and then I wanted to register for your panel, and then keep rejecting it. You closed for that applications.
Yep.
And I know in my community they need the interpreter, and then they can't find the interpreter, and they are always you mentioned that example before, they're in the court, because they don't interpreter, and then they close for the other matters. And I'm ready to go for them, but they need to register book through the multicultural. And there's a gap, little bit gap on this side.
Yeah. And that's really important issues that you raise. I can't solve your specific issue, obviously, but I think you've raised a lot of the complexities here about we need something that can respond in real time. But it's not just saying, and often there will be a situation where you'll have people who speak that language and say, I'm available. But when we're trying to put integrity in the system, to say it's a critical service that needs to have people with the right qualifications, if this is going to be a profession, then in doing that, you create barriers for that responsiveness that you've just spoken about. And that's why we need to think about, and this is why I said not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not easy. You need to think about the complexity of how you respond to this. You might want to think about how you tier who can respond and do what, kind of working out what are your core services. Now, that's not going to be what the review will kind of solve the problem on, but we'll flag that as a national initiative, government needs to think about how does it set that settings to allow that real-time kind of responses, being able to use what's available within community, but at the same time creating integrity in the profession. It's really hard. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I think where we could go wrong is if we try to find the black and white solutions. And I think also where we potentially have gone wrong is we've gone down those black and white paths with having it driven by market forces and also through procurement systems, which by their nature, government procurement services must be black and white for their accountability because they get hauled up in front of estimates in parliaments and those sorts of things. So how do you create that flex, that responsiveness? And even the member in the community will be just saying, I trust this person. I trust this person, so why can't they be my interpreter for this piece? But then there are so many other instances when you have, particularly, all of us will have seen all of those instances in domestic and family violence. As a service provider to refugees, we will have often both parties as our clients, and we kind of have to manage that bit. And you can't use the one interpreter for the two. And particularly when you're in a smaller community, being really careful about all of those other social dynamics that come in. I'm just flagging, I'm kind of not responding to your question directly in terms of giving you a solution, but saying it's really complex. And we've got an awareness of that complexity, and I think it's about everyone having awareness of that complexity to try to find ways to how we respond to these issues. And I think just finally, we haven't, obviously in the First Nations space for services, we still have so much to do, we haven't got it right, but there's also much we can learn. And I've been to the Northern Territory kind of translator-interpreter booth. It's amazing to kind of watch how that is done. And I think there's a core part there that's respect as a starting point. You have a respect for that particular community, that language, and that is, a good point to start at. And it comes from a perspective of not seeing as being lesser, responding to a lesser issue. It is responding to an issue which is absolutely equal in it. We want to actually honour and respect. Last question.
My name is Jomana. Hi, everyone. And I'm a broadcaster, a community broadcaster, and I'm an Arabic interpreter. Thank you for all the speeches and all the presentations. They were very informative for us. And I have a suggestion, not or a comment. Firstly, I was going to suggest that when Rob, I think, was talking before, I've been an interpreter just for 2 years. Within those 2 years, I learned a lot, and I've been noticing a lot of things within my career. And going back to the parking first, the only thing I think every time I want to get to a job, where I'm going to park, how long it's going to take me, and how long I'm going to sit inside the clinic to interpret for the patient, and how much I'm going to pay for the parking, where the money I make, I'm going to pay for the parking. So instead of concentrating on the patient and his sickness and his disease, I have to think how much I'm going to pay later on for the parking. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, it's a fundamental, critical service, our service. I'm imagining if they don't have any interpreters, how the other profession is going to survive without us. So a suggestion for all the interpreters, let's do a strike. I know some people cannot survive, and they cannot, financially they have some issues, but to find a result or to reach our goal, we have all the interpreters, every single interpreter, to strike at least for 2 days. And let me see all the professions, whether the court or the doctors or any profession, how they are going to survive without interpreters, because we have a lot of migrants, not only migrants, even people that have been here for 40 years, and they still cannot speak English because they didn't have the chance to learn the language. So our career is not only critical service, it's very, very important service to communicate between the professions and the person in front of us and us. So if we don't do this job for them, they're gonna suffer, and they won't have any patience the lawyers won't work, the courts won't work, because most of the people that are falling in this trap are the people, unfortunately, they don't speak proper English, or they cannot speak English. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
think we are all with you, Joanna, and there are committees of OSIT waiting for you to register because we need that type of. You're absolutely. Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to the report. Let's give a round of applause to Christine.
Thank you. Good to meet you.
So, I have an announcement, and Sylvia is going to give it to, because I didn't understand what you said.
The rustling.
Just the announcement is in relation to this discussion. If you've got the app, there is the third icon down the bottom, little group of faces. That's where you connect with others. If you just go there and then you click down, there are actually 3 questions that come to us from the Multicultural Framework Review panel. If you can respond to those, then we'll make sure that the responses get to the panel as well. I just asked whether the questions are now open until 7, so you've got 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. So what is going to happen now is that this session is closed. If you have a ticket for the welcome drinks, you may go to the Doncaster Hotel. If you don't have a ticket, unfortunately, the capacity is full. You are not able to purchase a ticket. You won't be able to access the premises. And we will see you tomorrow from 8 o'clock in the morning. The session starts at 9, and it will start here on time at 9 o'clock. Thank you all very much. And now I'll ask you please to leave the premises so we can secure them. Thank you very much.